Laramie, Wyoming Territory, 1878. Under the vast Wyoming sky that stretched endlessly above the rolling plains, Colton Zane believed one thing with absolute certainty. Love was a luxury no cowboy could afford, especially one who'd watched his parents' marriage crumble under the weight of frontier hardship. At 25, he'd built his life around that conviction, pouring every ounce of his energy into the small cattle operation he'd established on the outskirts of Laramie. The land demanded everything: his sweat, his blood, his undivided attention, and he told himself that was enough. "You can't eat romance," he often said to the other hands when they spoke of sweethearts in town. "Can't build a shelter with it either." The early spring morning found Colton mending fences along the northern boundary of his modest ranch. His strong hands worked methodically, muscles flexing beneath his worn cotton shirt as he hammered each nail with practiced precision. At 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders tapering to a trim waist, he cut an impressive figure against the landscape. His face, though weathered slightly by sun and wind, remained youthful, with clear blue eyes that mirrored the Wyoming sky and a strong jawline, softened only by the light stubble he hadn't bothered to shave away that morning. What he truly wanted, what he told himself was the only sensible ambition, was to expand his herd, perhaps by the adjacent property when Old Man Whitaker finally decided to sell. A man could build something lasting with land and cattle. People, on the other hand, people left. His mother had taught him that lesson when she'd abandoned them for a shopkeeper in Denver when Colton was just 13. As he drove the last nail home, the distant sound of wagon wheels caught his attention. Visitors were rare out this way, especially in early spring when the roads were still muddy from winter melt. Shielding his eyes against the morning sun, he watched as a wagon appeared over the rise, pulled by 2 chestnut horses and driven by a figure he couldn't quite make out. Curiosity piqued, he set down his hammer and started walking toward the approaching wagon. As it drew closer, he could see a young woman holding the reins, her posture straight and confident despite the rough terrain. The sunlight caught in her honey-blonde hair, which was pinned beneath a modest blue bonnet that matched the color of her traveling dress. When the wagon finally reached him, the young woman pulled the horses to a stop. Her clear green eyes met his, and something inexplicable shifted in the Wyoming air between them. "I'm looking for the Zane property," she said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern refinement that immediately marked her as not from these parts. "My father purchased supplies from a rancher named Zane last summer when our wagon train passed through. We've returned to settle permanently, and he suggested this might be a good place to inquire about available land." "You found it," Colton replied, suddenly conscious of his work-worn appearance. "Colton Zane. The property's mine." She smiled then, and it transformed her already beautiful face into something that made Colton momentarily forget the hammering waiting for his return. "I'm Tabitha Bell. Everyone calls me Tabby." She extended a gloved hand, which he took after a moment's hesitation. "My father is Benjamin Bell. We've come from Pennsylvania to start a new life." "That's a long way to travel on someone's casual recommendation," Colton said, releasing her hand perhaps a moment later than propriety dictated. "My father doesn't make decisions lightly, Mr. Zane," she replied with a spark of something spirited in her eyes. "And neither do I." At 20 years old, Tabitha Bell carried herself with a poise that belied the challenges of frontier travel. Her honey-blonde hair was fighting to escape its pins after the long journey, and her complexion, though naturally fair, had taken on a healthy glow from weeks under the western sun. "Well, Miss Bell, Whitaker's place borders mine to the east. He's been talking about selling for 3 seasons now. If your father's interested, I'd be happy to make introductions." Something in his willingness to help surprised even himself. Normally, he kept to his own affairs, avoiding entanglements with newcomers who often didn't last a year before the territory broke them. But there was something in Tabitha Bell's determined expression that suggested she and her family might be different. That evening, when Colton rode to town for supplies, he found himself inexplicably cleaning up more thoroughly than usual, putting on his least-worn shirt and even trimming his stubble before heading to the general store. He told himself it was simple courtesy to look presentable when meeting new neighbors. Benjamin Bell was a formidable man with a steely gaze and firm handshake. A widower of 5 years, he brought his daughter and teenage son west after deciding Pennsylvania held too many memories of his late wife. His handshake was firm, his gaze assessing as he took Colton's measure. "I appreciate the introduction to Whitaker," Bell said after preliminary introductions. "Been looking for good grazing land with reliable water." "His property has both," Colton confirmed. "Creek runs year-round, even in August." What he hadn't expected was for Tabitha to be working behind the counter, apparently having already secured employment with the storekeeper. "Mr. Zane," she greeted him with that same transformative smile. "Father says you've been most helpful." "Just being neighborly," he replied, suddenly aware of how his hat brim was frayed at the edges. "I hope you'll join us for supper Sunday after church," she said, placing his requested supplies on the counter with efficiency. "Father says we should get to know the established ranchers if we're to make a proper go of it here." That invitation, issued so casually, became the moment that would alter the course of Colton Zane's carefully ordered existence. Despite every intention to maintain his distance, to keep his focus solely on his ranch, he found himself riding to town that Sunday in his best clothes, a strange anticipation building in his chest that he refused to acknowledge. The Bell family had secured temporary lodgings above the dressmaker's shop, and Tabitha proved to be an accomplished cook despite the limitations of the small stove. Her younger brother, Nathan, was a serious boy of 16 who spoke earnestly about his ambitions to study law once they were established. "Tabby's the one who insisted we come west," Nathan confided when they stepped outside after the meal while Tabitha and her father cleared the table. "After Mother died, she said we needed a fresh start somewhere with big skies and new possibilities." "Takes courage," Colton acknowledged, thinking of the young woman who had seemed so at ease serving dinner, asking thoughtful questions about cattle management and the local markets. "Most Easterners find the territory too harsh." "Not Tabby," Nathan said with obvious admiration for his sister. "She's stronger than she looks. Been taking care of Father and me since Mother passed." When Tabitha joined them on the narrow porch, the setting sun caught in her hair, turning it to molten gold, and Colton felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest that he'd never experienced before. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Zane," she said, her green eyes meeting his directly. "It's good to make friends in a new place." "Colton," he corrected her, surprising himself. "Just Colton is fine." "Colton, then," she replied, his name sounding different somehow in her voice. "And I'm Tabby to my friends." By the time June arrived, bringing with it long, golden evenings and wildflowers carpeting the plains, the Bells had purchased Whitaker's property and begun the work of establishing their ranch. Benjamin Bell proved to be a quick study in Western ranching methods, and Colton found himself riding over more often than was strictly necessary to offer advice. He told himself it was neighborly duty that brought him to their half-built house that evening in late June, not the prospect of seeing Tabitha. She was hanging laundry when he approached, her sleeves rolled up to reveal slender arms tanned by weeks of outdoor work. Her blonde hair was plaited in a simple braid down her back, and she wore a practical calico dress that somehow looked more appealing to him than the fancy gowns worn by ladies in town. "You're working too hard," he said by way of greeting, dismounting from his horse. She turned, shielding her eyes against the evening sun. "Says the man who runs a ranch with only 2 hired hands," she countered with a smile. "Father's in the barn if you're looking for him." "Actually," Colton said, the words coming before he could reconsider them, "I was wondering if you might want to ride out to see the north pasture tomorrow. The wildflowers are at their peak, and I thought—" He stopped, suddenly feeling foolish. "Your father mentioned wanting to know which areas flood in spring." Tabitha's smile widened. "I'd like that very much. Father's riding into Cheyenne tomorrow on business, so I'm free of my usual chores." The next day dawned clear and perfect, the kind of Wyoming morning that made even the most hardened settler pause to appreciate the majesty of the landscape. Colton arrived at the Bell property earlier than necessary, having spent an unusual amount of time preparing himself and his horse for the outing. Tabitha was ready, dressed in a split riding skirt of dark blue that complemented her fair coloring. She rode astride rather than side saddle, another indication of her practical nature that Colton found himself admiring. "My father taught me to ride properly when I was 12, she explained when she caught his glance. Said a woman in mourning clothes perched sideways on a horse was asking for another funeral. They rode north across the rolling grassland, the morning sun warming their backs. Colton pointed out landmarks and shared the knowledge he'd accumulated about the territory's seasonal patterns. Tabitha listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that revealed her determination to understand this new land. When they reached the wildflower meadow, Colton helped her dismount, his hands lingering perhaps a moment too long at her waist. The meadow stretched before them, a riot of blue, yellow, and purple blossoms swaying gently in the breeze. "It's magnificent," Tabitha breathed, taking a few steps into the flowers. "I've never seen anything like it." "They'll be gone in another week," Colton said, watching her rather than the flowers. "That's the way of things out here. Beauty doesn't last long." She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps that makes it more precious, not less." Something about her words, or perhaps the way the sunlight illuminated her face, created a moment of clarity for Colton. Standing in that meadow with Tabitha Bell, he felt a possibility opening before him that he'd never allowed himself to consider. They spread a simple picnic on a blanket among the flowers. Tabitha had packed bread, cheese, and apple preserves, and they talked with surprising ease about their lives. She spoke of her mother's death from influenza, of her father's grief and subsequent determination to build a new life far from painful memories. Colton, normally reticent about his past, found himself telling her about his mother's abandonment and his father's slow decline thereafter. "Is that why you keep everyone at arm's length?" she asked directly, her green eyes searching his face. "I don't," he began to protest, then stopped. "The territory's harsh enough without adding personal disappointments. Focusing on the ranch is simpler." "Simpler, perhaps," she acknowledged, "but solitary. Don't you ever get lonely, Colton?" The question hung between them, more intimate than any they'd shared before. Before he could answer, a distant rumble of thunder broke the moment. Looking up, they saw dark clouds building rapidly on the western horizon. "Wyoming storms move fast," he said, rising quickly. "We should get back." They barely made it halfway home before the storm overtook them. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the trail slick and dangerous. Lightning flashed, followed by deafening thunder that spooked Tabitha's horse. As the animal reared, Colton reacted instantly, grabbing for her reins even as she fought to control her mount. "There's a line shack just over that rise," he shouted over the storm. "We can wait it out there." The abandoned line shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, used during calving season but empty now. They led the horses inside, where at least it was dry, if not particularly comfortable. Tabitha was soaked through, her hair plastered to her head, her riding skirt heavy with rain. "You're shivering," Colton observed, shrugging out of his leather vest. "Here, I'm fine," she insisted, though her teeth were chattering. "You're not," he countered, stepping closer to drape the vest around her shoulders. "That's the trouble with you Easterners. Too stubborn to admit when you're cold." The small space of the shack suddenly seemed to shrink as they stood facing each other. Rain drummed on the roof, creating a cocoon of sound that isolated them from the outside world. Water dripped from Colton's hair onto his cheeks, and without thinking, Tabitha reached up to brush it away. Her fingers lingered against his face, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Colton's hand came up to cover hers, holding it against his cheek. "Tabitha," he said, his voice low and rough. Her eyes met his, wide and questioning, and then she was in his arms, her rain-damp body pressing against his as their lips met in a kiss that started tentatively, but quickly deepened with an intensity that shocked them both. When they finally broke apart, breathless and disoriented, Tabitha touched her fingertips to her lips as though trying to confirm what had just happened. "I didn't plan that," Colton said, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Neither did I," she admitted, a blush rising to her cheeks. "But I can't say I'm sorry it happened." The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a washed-clean world and a newfound awareness between them that neither could ignore. As they rode back toward the Bell property, Colton knew with absolute certainty that his carefully constructed solitude had been irreparably breached. Benjamin Bell was waiting on the porch when they returned, his expression darkening as he took in their bedraggled appearance and the unmistakable tension between them. "Where have you been?" he demanded, helping his daughter dismount. "I returned early from Cheyenne to find you gone for hours in a storm." "We took shelter in a lined shack, Father," Tabitha explained. "Colton was showing me the northern boundaries of our property when the storm caught us." Benjamin's sharp gaze moved from his daughter to Colton. I expect better judgment from a man of your experience, Zane. The storm came up faster than anticipated. Colton replied evenly. I would never knowingly put your daughter in danger. The older man's expression remained stern. Tabitha, go inside and change before you catch your death. Zane, a word. Once Tabitha had reluctantly gone inside, Benjamin turned to Colton with undisguised scrutiny. I've seen how you look at my daughter, Zane, and I've noticed how often you find reason to ride over here. Mr. Bell, let me be clear, Benjamin interrupted. I brought my children west to give them a fresh start and new opportunities. Tabitha has prospects, real prospects. There's talk of the territorial governor's son coming to establish a bank in Laramie. A man of education and means. Colton felt his jaw tighten. And you've already decided that's what she wants? I've decided what's best for her future, Benjamin replied firmly. A struggling rancher with barely established holdings, isn't it? I won't have her throwing away her potential on a frontier romance that will leave her working her fingers to the bone just to survive. Shouldn't that be her decision? Colton challenged, anger rising in his chest. She's young and impressionable. The frontier has a way of making women rush into attachments out of necessity rather than sound judgment. Benjamin stepped closer, his voice hardening. I forbid any courtship between you and my daughter. Is that understood? Pride and indignation warred in Colton's chest, but before he could respond, the door opened and Tabitha emerged, having changed into a dry dress. Is everything all right? She asked, looking between them with concern. Perfectly fine, her father assured her with a forced smile. Mr. Zane was just leaving. Colton looked at Tabitha, wanting to tell her everything, to defy her father's edict openly, but the weight of Benjamin Bell's words hung between them. A struggling rancher. A frontier romance that would bring her hardship rather than happiness. I should get back, he said finally, his voice tight. Good evening, Miss Bell. The confusion and hurt that flashed across her face as he used the formal address cut him deeply, but he mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, the taste of their rain-soaked kiss still on his lips. The next 2 weeks passed in agonizing slowness. Colton threw himself into ranch work, rising before dawn and working until exhaustion forced him to sleep. He avoided town and made excuses when neighboring ranchers invited him to social gatherings where the Bells might be present. Then came the letter, delivered by Nathan Bell himself one sweltering July afternoon. Tabby asked me to bring this, the boy said, looking uncomfortable as he handed over the folded paper. She said it's important. Colton waited until Nathan had ridden away before opening the letter with fingers that weren't quite steady. Colton, my father has told me of his conversation with you. He believes he acts in my best interest, but he does not know my heart as I do. If what happened between us in the line shack meant anything to you, meet me tomorrow at sunset by the old cottonwood tree near the creek boundary between our properties. Tabitha, the appointed hour, found Colton pacing beside the ancient cottonwood, torn between hope and dread. When Tabitha finally appeared, riding quickly across the open grassland, his heart leapt at the sight of her. She dismounted before he could help her, her movements betraying her agitation. You've been avoiding me, she accused without preamble. Your father made his wishes very clear, Colton replied, keeping a careful distance between them despite his desire to close it. And what about my wishes? She demanded, her green eyes flashing. Do they count for nothing? Tabitha, he began, then stopped, struggling to find the right words. Your father isn't wrong. I am a struggling rancher. The territory is harsh, unforgiving. The life I can offer you would be filled with hardship. And you think I'm too delicate to endure hardship? She stepped closer, challenging him. That I came west expecting ease and luxury? I chose this life, Colton. I wanted the challenge, the open sky, the chance to build something meaningful. Your father wants better for you. And I want you. The words hung in the air between them, bold and unmistakable. Unless I've misunderstood what's growing between us. Colton closed the distance between them then, unable to maintain his resolve in the face of her courage. His hands framed her face as he kissed her with all the longing he'd suppressed since their last encounter. You haven't misunderstood anything, he said when they finally broke apart. But your father will come around eventually, she insisted. He wants my happiness above all. And if he doesn't? A shadow crossed her face. Then we'll face that when we must. For now, can we just have this time? These moments. So began a summer of secret meetings, at the wildflower meadow, by the creek, once even in town when they happened to visit the general store at the same time and stole 5 precious minutes of conversation behind the building. Each encounter deepened their connection, transforming what might have been a fleeting attraction into something neither could deny. During one such meeting in late August, as they sat beneath the cottonwood watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, Colton finally gave voice to what had been growing in his heart. "I love you, Tabitha Bell," he said simply, the words feeling both momentous and entirely natural. "I never thought I'd say that to anyone, but there it is." Her answering smile was radiant as she twined her fingers with his. "And I love you, Colton Zane, enough to stand against my father's wishes if necessary." That declaration, made with such certainty, should have filled him with joy, but instead, a weight settled in his chest. "I won't come between you and your family," he said. "I know what it's like to lose a parent. I won't be the cause of that for you." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered their private world. Benjamin Bell rode into view, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. "So this is why you've been so eager to help with chores and then disappear for hours," he said to Tabitha, his voice cold with disappointment. "Sneaking around behind my back after I expressly forbade this." "Father, please," Tabitha began, rising to her feet. "Get on your horse," Benjamin ordered. "We'll discuss this at home." "Mr. Bell," Colton interjected, stepping forward. "I love your daughter. My intentions are honorable." "Your intentions are irrelevant," Benjamin snapped. "I've made arrangements. The governor's son arrives next month to establish the bank. He's expressed interest in meeting Tabitha." "I won't meet him," Tabitha declared, lifting her chin in defiance. "I won't be traded like cattle to advance your ambitions, father." "This isn't about ambition. It's about securing your future," Benjamin insisted. "In 5 years' time, when the novelty of frontier romance has worn off and you're struggling to feed your children on a rancher's uncertain income, you'll thank me." The confrontation escalated, with Tabitha standing her ground and Benjamin growing increasingly adamant. Colton watched helplessly as the gulf between father and daughter widened with every exchange. "Enough," he finally said, his voice cutting through their argument. "This stops now." Both Bells turned to look at him in surprise. "Mr. Bell," Colton continued, his decision crystallizing as he spoke, "I won't be the cause of this division between you and Tabitha. Family is too precious to sacrifice, even for love." "Colton, no," Tabitha protested, reading his intent in his expression. He turned to her, his heart breaking even as he forced his voice to remain steady. "Your father wants what's best for you. Perhaps he sees more clearly than we do, blinded by our feelings." "You don't mean that," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "I think it's best if we end this now," he said, each word feeling like a physical pain in his chest. "Before it goes any further." The betrayal in her eyes was almost more than he could bear, but he held firm, believing in that moment that the pain of separation now was better than the inevitable resentment that would come if she lost her family for his sake. "You're a coward, Colton Zane," she said finally, her voice thick with tears. "Not because you won't stand up to my father, but because you won't fight for what you claim to want." She mounted her horse without assistance and rode away without looking back, leaving Colton standing with Benjamin Bell in the gathering dusk. "You did the right thing," Benjamin said after a long silence. "No," Colton replied, watching Tabitha's figure grow smaller in the distance. "But I did what you wanted. Now go after your daughter. She needs you more than she needs your plans for her future." September brought the first hints of autumn to Wyoming and the news that Benjamin Bell had accepted a position representing territorial business interests in Washington. The appointment would take him east for at least a year, possibly longer, and he would be taking his family with him. Colton learned this not from Tabitha, whom he hadn't seen since their painful parting, but from the general store owner as he purchased supplies in town. "Leaving next week, I hear," the shopkeeper said, wrapping parcels of coffee and sugar. Miss Bell seemed quite eager to go. Something about reconnecting with Eastern society after her frontier adventure, as she called it. Each word was a fresh cut. So she had embraced her father's vision after all, relegating their time together to nothing more than a temporary diversion. Pride kept him from riding to the Bell property to say goodbye. If she had already dismissed their relationship so casually, He would not humiliate himself by appearing to pine for her. Instead, he channeled his hurt into work, expanding his herd and improving his ranch house with a determination that bordered on obsession. The day the Bells were scheduled to depart, Colton deliberately rode in the opposite direction, spending the entire day checking fence lines along his western boundary. Only when he was certain their train would have left did he allow himself to return home, where he found Nathan Bell waiting on his porch. "Thought you'd be halfway to Cheyenne by now," Colton said, dismounting with a wariness that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "Train leaves tomorrow," Nathan replied, standing as Colton approached. "I came to give you this." He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. When Colton made no move to take it, the boy placed it on the porch railing. "She said to tell you she meant every word she ever said to you," Nathan added, his young face solemn. "And that some things are worth waiting for, even if you have to wait a lifetime." After Nathan left, Colton sat on the porch steps for a long time before finally reaching for the package. Inside, he found a daguerreotype of Tabitha, her expression serious but her eyes holding a warmth that made his chest ache. With it was a pressed wildflower from the meadow where they had shared their picnic and a brief note in her elegant handwriting. "Some flowers return, even after the harshest winter." That night, Colton dreamed of wildflowers and honey blonde hair, and woke with the taste of lost bitter on his tongue. By noon, he had made his decision. He would go to the station, speak to her before the train departed. Benjamin Bell's disapproval be damned. He rode hard, pushing his horse to its limits, only to arrive at the station as the train pulled away, steam billowing from its stack. Through the window of the last passenger car, he caught a glimpse of honey blonde hair and a pale face turned toward the Wyoming landscape as though memorizing its contours one last time. She was gone. The years that followed tested Colton in ways he never anticipated. A harsh winter in 1879 decimated his herd, forcing him to rebuild almost from nothing. The Bell property, left in the care of a manager who proved less than competent, fell into disrepair. When it came up for auction in 1881, Colton purchased it, unable to bear watching it pass to strangers. He wrote to Tabitha once, a careful letter explaining his acquisition of her father's property and offering to sell it back should the family ever return to Wyoming. The reply came not from her, but from Benjamin Bell, a terse note acknowledging the transaction and indicating they had no plans to return to the territory. Tabitha, he mentioned in closing, was being courted by a promising young congressman. Life continued. Colton expanded his operation, hired more hands, and built the substantial ranch he'd always envisioned. In town, he was respected as a successful cattleman who dealt fairly and supported community improvements. If the storekeepers' wives occasionally attempted to introduce him to visiting nieces or new schoolteachers, he was unfailingly polite but firmly disinterested. In the spring of 1885, 7 years after Tabitha Bell had left Wyoming, Colton rode into Laramie to purchase supplies and collect his mail. Among the usual business correspondence was a telegram that had arrived the previous day. Arriving Laramie Station April 15th, stop noon train, stop T Bell April 15th, was tomorrow. Colton read the telegram 3 times, his heart hammering against his ribs. 7 years. 7 years without a word directly from her. And now this cryptic message that told him nothing of her circumstances or intentions. He spent a restless night alternating between hope and dread. Perhaps she was married now, returning only to sell her father's former property. Perhaps she simply felt nostalgia for the place where she'd spent that one formative summer. Perhaps, and this was the hope he tried hardest to suppress, she remembered him as more than a youthful indiscretion. The station platform was crowded when he arrived the next day, having taken more care with his appearance than he had in years. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, his clothes the best he owned. At 25, he had been a promising young rancher. At 32, he was a man of substance. His youthful features matured into a rugged handsomeness that turned more than a few female heads as he waited for the train. When it finally arrived in a cloud of steam and noise, Colton found himself searching the disembarking passengers with an intensity that left him oblivious to everything else. And then, suddenly, she was there. Tabitha Bell stood on the platform, scanning the crowd with the same purposeful gaze he remembered. At 27, she was no longer the fresh-faced girl who had challenged his solitude, but a woman in her prime. Her honey blonde hair was styled more elegantly now, and her traveling suit of deep burgundy spoke of Eastern sophistication. But her green eyes were unchanged, clear, direct, and currently fixed directly on him. For a moment, neither moved. 7 years stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and paths not taken. Then Tabitha began walking toward him, her steps measured but determined. "Colton Zane," she said when she reached him, her voice slightly deeper than he remembered but still achingly familiar. "You look exactly as I've pictured you all these years." "Tabitha," he managed, suddenly aware that he had rehearsed no greeting. "Welcome back to Wyoming." An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with all that remained unsaid. "I received your telegram," he finally continued. "I wasn't sure. That is, your father mentioned a congressman." A smile touched her lips, warming her eyes. "Did he?" How very like father to create the impression he wanted rather than acknowledge reality. Hope flared in Colton's chest. "Then you're not married?" "No." She glanced around the busy platform. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private?" They walked to a small cafe near the station, the silence between them gradually easing into something less strained. Over coffee, Tabitha explained that her father had passed away 3 months earlier after a brief illness. "I'm sorry," Colton said sincerely. "I know how close you were, despite your differences." "We reconciled, in time," she said, turning her coffee cup in elegant hands that still showed faint calluses from ranch work. "He came to realize that his vision for my happiness and my own were not the same." "And Nathan?" "Practicing law in Boston and doing very well." She hesitated, then added, "I stayed in Washington after father's appointment ended. Worked as a teacher, established a life there. It wasn't unpleasant." "But you've come back," Colton observed, the question implicit in his tone. "I've come back," she confirmed, meeting his gaze directly. "The question is whether I'm too late." The words hung between them, freighted with meaning and possibility. Outside the cafe window, Laramie continued its bustling afternoon activities, unaware of the moment of reckoning taking place within. "You told me once that I was a coward for not fighting for what I wanted," Colton said, his voice low and intent. "You were right. I let fear of coming between you and your father dictate my actions. It's my greatest regret." "We were both young," Tabitha replied. "I was harsh in my judgment." "No, you were honest," he countered. "And you deserved better than what I gave you." She reached across the table then, her fingers brushing his in a touch that sent electricity through his veins despite its lightness. "I meant what Nathan delivered in my message. Some things are worth waiting for, even a lifetime." 7 years isn't quite a lifetime," Colton said, turning his hand to capture hers. "But it's been long enough to know what I want, what I should have fought for then." "And what is that, Colton Zane?" she asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "You," he said simply. "It's always been you, Tabitha. Even when I told myself I was better off alone, even when I convinced myself that love was a luxury I couldn't afford, it was always you." Her smile bloomed then, transformative as it had been that first day on his property. "I hoped you would say that. I've spent 7 years building a life that could stand on its own, becoming a woman who chooses her path rather than having it chosen for her. But my heart has been here, in Wyoming, with you." Outside the cafe, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Laramie's Main Street, Colton took Tabitha's hand in his. "I have something to show you, if you're willing to ride out to the ranch." The land looked its best in the golden light of approaching evening as they rode up to what had once been the Bell property. Colton had renovated the house, expanding it into a comfortable residence that maintained its frontier charm while adding touches of refinement. "You've kept it all this time," Tabitha said, taking in the well-maintained buildings and healthy cattle grazing in the distance. "I couldn't let it go," Colton admitted as he helped her down from her horse. "Even when Sense told me you were never coming back, I held on to this piece of land that connected me to you." He led her to the cottonwood tree where they had last parted, now 7 years older, but still standing strong against the Wyoming sky. From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. "I've carried this for 2 years," he said, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "Bought it in Denver on a cattle drive. Told myself it was foolish, but couldn't bring myself to return it." Tabitha's eyes widened, her hand coming to her throat in a gesture of surprise. Colton, I love you, Tabitha Bell, he said, taking her hand in his. I've loved you since that day in the wildflower meadow, maybe even since the moment you drove that wagon onto my property. I was wrong to let you go without a fight, wrong to think that protecting you from conflict with your father was more important than what we could build together. He knelt then, there beneath the cottonwood tree where they had once declared their love and then lost it. I'm asking for a second chance. Will you marry me, Tabitha? Will you build a life here with me, under these Wyoming skies that have never seemed quite as blue since you left? Tears glistened in her green eyes as she looked down at him, and for a terrible moment, he feared he had misread everything. Then she smiled, that radiant smile that had haunted his dreams for 7 years. Yes, she said, her voice strong and certain. Yes, Colton Zane, I will marry you. I've waited 7 years to come home to you, and I don't intend to waste another day. When he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to take her in his arms, the kiss they shared was both a homecoming and a new beginning, sweet with the knowledge of time lost and the promise of the future stretching before them. Their wedding took place that autumn in the newly built Laramie Church, with Nathan traveling from Boston to give his sister away. The townspeople who had watched Colton's solitary existence for years remarked on the transformation in the rancher, how the habitual reserve in his expression had given way to unabashed happiness. On a crisp October evening, Colton carried his bride across the threshold of their home, the ranch house he had expanded over the years, as though preparing it for her return without consciously acknowledging the hope. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zane," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the warm parlor where a fire crackled in the hearth. Tabitha's arms remained around his neck as she smiled up at him. "It feels right, being here with you." As though these 7 years were just a detour on the path that was always meant to bring us together. Later, as they lay entwined in the large bed that had seemed so empty for so long, Colton traced the contours of his wife's face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Do you know what I thought that day you drove up in your wagon?" he asked, his voice soft in the quiet room. "What?" she murmured, her eyes half closed in contentment. "That you were a complication I didn't need," he admitted with a rueful smile. "That love was a luxury no cowboy could afford." "And now," she prompted, her fingers trailing along his bare shoulder. "Now I know it's not a luxury," he said, drawing her closer. "It's a necessity, as essential as air or water. I existed without you, Tabitha, but I didn't truly live until you came back." She kissed him then, a kiss full of promise and passion and the shared understanding that comes from finding your way home after a long journey. Spring returned to Wyoming as it always did, painting the plains with wildflowers and new growth. On the ranch that now bore both their names, Colton and Tabitha Zane stood on the porch of their home, watching the sunrise illuminate their land. Tabitha's hand rested protectively on the gentle swell of her stomach, where their first child grew, a new life created from the love they had fought to reclaim. 7 years, Colton mused, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "When I think of how close we came to losing this forever." "But we didn't lose it," Tabitha reminded him, leaning into his embrace. "Some flowers do return, even after the harshest winter." And as they stood together watching the Wyoming day unfold before them, both knew that their love, tested by time and separation, strengthened by patience and perseverance, would continue to bloom season after season under the vast western sky they both called home.